Hi and welcome to this episode of Watercolor Shorts. I'm Howard Jones and I thought I'd mix things up a bit this week because I'm usually either working from photographs, directly from photographs, or I'm working from complete imagination. But this week I thought I'd use a bit of both. So I'm sort of digging out a couple of photographs to get me fired up, and we'll see. Really, it's a case of sort of allowing the painting to morph. So I hope you enjoy this one, and see you soon. I like to keep the momentum going. That's to say that what I mean by that is that I paint as regularly as I possibly can, and sometimes that momentum can be held up because you feel as though you've exhausted your library of photos or whatever, and you just don't know what to paint. And in those situations, what I tend to do is I either paint completely from imagination, which is what I did in the last episode of these short tutorials, or I just rifle through a few of my previous I go through some of my photos from my collection, and I take inspiration from photos rather than, because I've painted this perhaps once before, maybe more than once before. And so what I do is I just pull out these photos to give me inspiration to make something up. So this is an old miller's cottage not far from where I live. It doesn't have to be directly, the image doesn't have to be a direct representation of what I've got in mind. These are coastal buildings, sort of a bit cottage-like. So in my head I'm thinking I want to paint this sort of cottage scene. Even something like this, it's a photo of an older building, but it just gives me ideas. It feeds my imagination. This is an old barn. And what I'm thinking of at the moment is just creating something. I really like derelict buildings, old derelict buildings with large shapes. This huge, this is obviously a sort of service building where perhaps the local farmer's kept his machinery or animals. And of course, there's always the opportunity to put in trees, adding trees to these scenes. So once I've sort of fired up my imagination, I then look to making out a sketch, and this is what I've done here. And this is going to be my sort of sketch. I have this idea, and it could be it could be a little bit from memory. I'm pretty certain somewhere along the line when I've been out painting out of doors or just walking around, that I've come across a scene something like this. I'm very lucky where I live here in Wales in the UK to have lots of old, very old cottages, farmers' cottages, in often quite derelict places, isolated places. And what that allows me to do is to exercise my imagination, my creative side. So what I've got is, I've got this idea of putting in this little cottage. So I've done this little sort of thumbnail sketch. So this would be my layout. So that's what I'm going to go at. I may use a bit of pen and wash, and I'll tell you what sort of colours I'm using as I go. There'll be a list of the colours below in the description of this video. So let's get started. So nice to see, I like to see some verticals, which will be my trees, and specifically these sort of trees, I'm thinking they're conifers, maybe this Scots pine or Douglas fir. I'll place in the roof of my old cottage here, something like this. I like to make it angular, to sort of tell the story that this roof has been sat on this building for many years, perhaps as much as 150 years, 200 years. And so there is some, the planes start to sag. These facets. The roof almost becomes a multitude, if you like, of different little sort of angles and facets. So as I said, I'll probably add a little bit of pen work to this. I like to give these chimneys, as they often have, rather large chimneys, relatively speaking, for the size of the property. We'll bring the wall down about here. Window this side, just two sort of lozenge shapes for now. And then perhaps what we'll have is, and I do see a lot of this in the Welsh valleys in here, near where I live, are these old sort of walls made often from slate, or partly from slate, and they offer a very geometrical shape. So I like to do the what I call the crest stones. I think they're referred to as cock and hen stones, the ones that sit directly on top of the wall, making it look quite ornate. So we'll have some sort of end pillar of stone, about something like this. It's a nice abstract sort of shape to things. Do something similar, and even this is an opportunity to get creative, is to make up your shapes. And I concern myself mostly with just the top stones. What goes on inside the wall, like for instance in these sort of areas, you know, we can make up with texture. We can texture the application of paint that we use. So I think I'm okay with that. We'll have a grassy foreground. I'll just pencil in a couple of grass-like shapes, though I probably will not paint individual grasses as I'm doing now. This just to tell me the story. It's just to give me the information that I'm sort of seeing. So, okay. Let's put some pen on this. I have a various selection of pens to hand when I'm doing adding pen to my paintings. I wouldn't strictly call this pen and wash, but you know, it's pen. It's the use of pen nonetheless. So I'm using a selection I use. This is made by Shinhan Touch Liner. Probably my favourite universal all-rounder is probably the Staedtler pigment liner. I'm using a 0.4 nib here, and it's strange. I really prefer these pens when they're sort of almost running out of ink. They deliver a more broken line. Just put some pots in here, and I like to scratch. This one might have run out of, I think this one has probably run out completely of ink. Let's try this one. It's a bit better. So I like to make sort of scratchy, broken lines, if you like. As I say, I'm very mindful to make the roofs look like they're in separate, they're almost cells. They're individual shapes, very abstract shapes. Along the top of this, like the ridge of this roof here, think of it as a sort of spine almost, you know, like one of those sort of prehistoric animal sort of shapes. But take the lines at random angles as it tumbles down the roof. Now as I get to the edge of the roof, I will make quite a fuss of that line at the bottom of the roof, because that will be a shadowed overhang. As I say, I keep my windows almost just like two sort of elongated lozenge shapes, with the hint of a frame in between. I'll do the same now to outline most of my stones. Maybe one of these sort of gate lugs, a steel lug there that pops out, that receives the gate if there were to be one. It's probably long gone, disappeared. So the line is such a powerful thing, I think. so enjoy working with the line. And these random gaps, the stones as they sit on the wall are random, and so are the sort of gaps in between the stones. They are random sort of intervals, just to make them more interesting. Same over here, perhaps this stone shaped something like that. Its neighbouring stone slightly different, more angular stone here perhaps. And then what happens in the actual main part of the wall, I'm not too concerned with. I'm not going to concern myself with too much. As I say, that's sort of, we'll leave that to the paint. So really that's probably all I need to do. I won't put too much pen work in the trees because unless they're very close in proximity, close, maybe they're up close behind the cottage, then they would get a little bit of this sort of line work. But anything further off in the distance, I tend not to use the pen line. The next thing we need to do, of course, is put a wash on here. And I'm going for this colour palette rather than use my regular colour palette. I do like to move away from the regular thing from time to time. You know, I personally feel like I get a bit bogged down sometimes if I stick to the same colours. I think it's a really good, if you've only just started in watercolour, or any medium for that matter, it is a good idea to stick to a standard colour mix, and I'd be more than happy to send, you know, if you want to drop a comment into the questions into the comments, I'd be more than happy to give you my my standard colour palette. I'll explain why I'm using these 6 colours. It'll be 7 probably, because I like to use a little bit of white gouache. Once I've put them out, I'll explain why I've chosen these 6 colours. So these colours are, from left to right, this is Alizarin Crimson, this is Burnt Sienna, this is Ultramarine Blue, this is Indigo Blue, this one is Lemon Yellow, and this one is Phthalo Green. So effectively, what I've got are the primary colours. I have 2 reds. You might not think that Burnt Sienna you'd consider that, categorise that as a red, but it is. It's an orangey red. The 2 blues, Ultramarine Blue and Indigo. The Indigo is a very dark blue, ink-like blue, and 1 yellow and 1 green. So basically, they're sort of the 3 primaries. Admittedly, the green is considered to be a secondary colour, but the 3 primaries being red, blue, and yellow. So it gives me a good, you can almost mix any colour from these 6 colours. So let's get a wash down. So these are the brushes I think I'll be using. I've sort of tried to cover every eventuality. I have a large wash brush, a mop. I have a large 1-inch flat brush for making geometric shapes and shadows and things. Slightly larger round brush, which is a synthetic size 10. This is just an acrylic brush. It's a little square brush, a number 4. This is a rigger brush, and it's, I believe it's a size 3. And this is just a really cheap hog hair brush because I like to create texture with that type of brush. You can just see it there. So I'll start with this one. Just going to pick up a little bit of ultramarine blue. A little bit of indigo, and we'll just get a bit of colour into here. But I sort of want to, I'm thinking of a sort of nice spring-like sort of day, so I'm just going to bring in a little bit of cool yellow, a little bit of that burnt sienna, and we'll warm up parts of this lower sky. So I'm not being overly careful to paint round the cottage. Lots of water, not too much paint in this mix. There, and I think we'll just run that up into the upper sky a little bit now. There's just a little bit of cool still remaining at the top of this sky. Okay, and just bring a little bit into the roof, maybe something like that. I'll use a slightly stronger mix of burnt sienna for this wall. I don't mind things drifting, because if I make contact, of course, with that background, each colour is going to drift into the other. So I'm sort of being careful in a way not to sort of push too much into the background. But what I do want in this near wall is, although I've started the colour warm by using burnt sienna, I'm going to fairly quickly, I'm going to cool it off. So this time, just wringing out that brush and picking up some clean water. This time I'm picking up ultramarine blue with a little bit of indigo. Indigo is a very, very strong colour. Having said that, it always looks stronger when it's picked up and it's fresh. It dries out surprisingly lighter or lighter than it appears first of all. So my idea being that we'll have some sort of warmer grasses in the front down here like this. Okay, so I'll play around a little bit more in this wall because I do want, quite happy to make it quite textured. So what should we put in there? A little bit more burnt sienna, perhaps with a bit of the lemon yellow this time. So we've got creating a bit of a green. Imagine a lot of you know, a lot of moss and things like that colouring this wall, giving this wall its colour. Play around even further. I'm really more than happy to just play around and create this texture. As I say, we'll join this up. I'll come. I'm trying. You know, what I want to do is just stay out of this. Mostly stay out of this lower foreground, immediate foreground. But I just want this wall to be somewhere, perhaps a little warmer now. Perhaps I'll just pick up a little bit of the burnt sienna again. But each time I go in, I'm probably a little more discerning as to where I place the paint. So the first washes into that wall were very general and broad. But now the paint gets increased and the water gets decreased, and I'm a little bit more careful in how I shape these colours that I'm applying. Just going to take a bit of water in this size 10 round brush, and I'll tap a little bit of that into the wall, which has a great effect. It just really has a wonderful effect for that type of texture. And another little trick, just pick up a smaller brush again, pick up the lemon yellow with a bit of the indigo, a little bit of burnt sienna, and just drop the occasional dark green into some parts of that wall. We'll leave that like that for the moment. I want to turn my attention now to the the windows, and for that I'm just gonna, this is that funny little square brush that it's an acrylic brush, a brush designed for acrylic paints, but I quite like the fact that it's a stubby little square shape, and I know that it's going to give me a nice single brush mark. Right, if I were to use a little pointed brush, which I do, of course, I use small pointed brushes quite a lot, but for this, as I say, it gives me a very specific shape. So just one brush mark there for that, another brush mark there. I haven't completed the second one, because I'll show you what I'll do with that in a moment. Deliberately haven't completed that shape. Okay, so just going to speed dry this so that I can do the trees next. So I'm going to use the really little cheap hog hair brush. It's a flat. It's about 1/2 inch, something like that. And I want to put these trees in with as little fuss as possible. So, you know, painting in the loose style like this requires minimum of brushwork to be really economical with your brushwork. So I'm just scrubbing mostly dry. The mix was indigo, burnt sienna mostly, with a little bit of lemon yellow. So think about, you know, how these particular trees grow. They tend to sort of almost come out like, almost like sort of platforms of growth, of greenery, like this. And I'll add a little bit of alizarin crimson just to darken up some of those greens in areas, mostly the central area like this. And then we'll put in a few others back here. Add some depth to that one. Just think of their tree trunks very straight. That's just by turning the brush over on its side like that and pushing your brush stroke. I like to, if these are the tree trunks, I like to put a little bit of alizarin crimson in those tree trunks. And it gives that, as I say, that particular species of tree. Now I might just come back. Let's have something popping out over here, just beyond the little cottage. So I might come back to those trees in a moment and just sort of play around with the paint application a little bit more. While that paint is still wet, I often just run out. This is just a palette knife. You can use your thumbnails if you're not too precious about your thumbnails. But yeah, you can also run a broken credit card through here just to infer a few tree trunks. Now I'm going to give this little cottage some colour in its roof. And often these roofs are often in quite famous Welsh slate. Wales was a very big producer of slate. Many years ago, it was a very big industry that and Welsh slate used to be exported right across the globe. So it's quite a common scene rather to see these slate roofs around these in these particular areas. So I'm using mostly indigo there for the slate colour, but I'll probably just pop a little bit of alizarin crimson in just here and there. I'm going to use mostly burnt sienna and alizarin crimson for the chimney. We'll give it a different colour. Probably a bit strong, so I need to take that back a little bit. And there's the colour you need to take red back, of course, is green. So I'll just pick up a little bit of the phthalo green, and that will knock the red back. Okay. Okay, now let's move into the foreground, and as I mentioned earlier, I just want to sort of suggest coarse grasses, wild grass. So again, you know, the beauty of using a really cheap brush like this is that you can be absolutely brutal with it, and you do need to be brutal with it to create the type of shapes that I'm about to show you. So I'm picking up burnt sienna, a little bit of lemon yellow, not too much water. I'll pick up some water in a moment. So that's burnt sienna, lemon yellow. Let's take a little swipe of that green mix that we were using a moment ago. And now a small amount of water. So I want this sort of foreground to suggest perhaps that there's some sunlight just hitting a select area of this scene. We can, for a little bit of cohesion, we can just use a little bit of that colour perhaps on this top right side of our conifer tree. That too might be just receiving a little bit of the morning sunshine there. All the time this is just you know, the advantage, and what's really important I think to point out here is the advantage. Why paint this way? Why not just use photographs all the time? Well, for one, as I've mentioned already, photographs, you can exhaust your photograph library, but perhaps I think for the artistic reason, and that is that we don't actually learn, we're not exercising our ability to create and invent if we only work from photos. I work from photos, I work from photos a lot. But I learned to paint by painting from imagination. What happens is, I think, when you're working from photos, you seem to sort of ignore the fact that you're supposed to be creating. You know, you need to be knowing what paint does when it goes down and two paints go down together on top of each other with various amounts of water. Though those skills do get overlooked when you're painting from photos, simply because you become more concerned in making your painting look like the photo. So your brain is dealing with a completely separate issue. It's not really dealing with what is required to learn to paint. It's dealing with what is required to copy an image that already exists. So so let's just finish this off. A little bit more warmth down here. So I'm increasing the amount of burnt sienna very slightly just here. We'll just get a little bit more of that lemon yellow and burnt sienna mix going again, just about here. And I will sometimes just run a scraper through here. I'm really just trying to match the textures to the environment, if you like. You know, it would be a very different sort of texture required if we were doing a street scene. So, you know, I think it's really important, as I say, to get into the mood and the atmosphere. And that's another thing too, that you know, you can't, when you set yourself free from copying photographs, you can decide upon the mood and atmosphere of your painting, not the one that's staring back at you from the photograph. You can create your own, and I really like that. I like to be able to do that. And I think that's an important part of painting in the loose style, is to break free from just, you know, only using photographs. I just want to get these top stones looking a little more interesting. So I've just picked up a bit of indigo blue, bit of burnt sienna. I'm just Doing a little bit more in the wall itself. A little bit of alizarin crimson here, and I'm just going to let this dry off. Let's hint upon a little bit of a shadow underneath here. Like that, maybe a shadow under the lintel of the chimney, and a little bit of that red, that warmer colour, just in one of those windows perhaps. Okay, let's finish this painting. Just spot a little bit of, this is just a mix of alizarin crimson and phthalo green. Now I shall dry this, and then we'll add some atmosphere by using shadow. So I've mixed up my shadow from a little bit of ultramarine blue, a little bit of indigo blue, a bit of burnt alizarin crimson, and a small amount of burnt sienna. So safest place to, I always sort of start somewhere where perhaps if I'm wrong, if the mix is too strong or not strong enough, it doesn't matter, because I could take it off. Say if I went in here underneath the tree and I thought it's too strong or it's not strong enough, I could just simply lift it off and then adjust my colour mix again. Shadows coming into the lower left hand areas of this shape down here. But where we have the fun, probably the best fun, is on the building itself. So we'll undershadow that edge. We'll shadow slightly that window there. And I mentioned earlier about how I like to just put a little bit of why I left the lower part of that window. I didn't complete the shape with the paint. Because I like to sort of hint upon a little bit of warm light in the lower part of the window, just to break things up. So this is the 1-inch flat brush that I'm using. The light's probably coming down here. It's underneath the lintel on the chimney there. The chimney then is sending its shadow across here. And I think it would be really good if we were to shadow, suggest the shadow coming from off the trees here came across the roof like that. Now just pick up a smaller brush, hinting upon those lines like that, and then maybe the shadow is completely over one section of this wall down here, something like that, leaving this in the light, all this area in the light, and just soften off one or two edges. So I'm just lifting, dropping the brush here and lifting into the edge of the shadow. And then shadow over the foreground, probably a bit of shadow into the wall. We'd expect that, of course. But what you're doing here is cutting out the foreground. I mean, literally cutting it out, almost as though this is a pair of scissors and you're cutting an edge into this foreground shape here. Just something like this. Sort of same here. Maybe there's some bounced light illuminating this part of the wall over here, rather than make it all, you know, too regimental. What we'll say is there's just a few shadowed areas somewhere down here. Into that. And again, as I mentioned before, just want to sort of play around, I think, with some of those shapes up there. So I'll go back to my cheap scruffy hog hair brush and I'll just scrub some of those drier brush marks out, leaving some dry brush marks to show, and others are softened. Particularly up here in the corners like this, you know, to sort of almost vignette the edges of the painting down here. And any other further adjustments? Maybe there's a low-lying hedge back there. Something like that. Leaving a nice peaceful area here. If it's too flat, if you feel as though that area is too flat, it's always nice just to hint upon some wildlife. Just a couple of perhaps nesting crows coming in to roost. A couple of extra lines down the roof maybe here. And I'm still wondering whether that possibly is too large an area for it to be, you know, that plain and simple, that flat. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to place just the hint of, perhaps there's just a small woodland back there, back here, leaving a gap somewhere like this. And then that ties up with what's going on this side. Little bit of spatter from white gouache. So I take the white paint straight out of the tube of the paint like this. Plenty of water in the brush, and I'll just tap a little bit of that paint into some of those areas. Sort of seed heads, you get that, gives the sort of impression of things floating around in the air. It's summer seed heads. And perhaps just finish the final little flurry. We can say, you know, there were things that sometimes tied up off the wall here. They perhaps tethered the farm goat up to the walls here in places. Just what I'm creating really is an atmosphere, is a mood. You know, you can't sort of you can't put a tag on everything. You can't give everything a label. Is it light, you know, or is it just, are these just objects? It just adds a little bit of additional interest, really. That's really all I'm doing with that. So let's put the mount round it and see what we've got there. There we are. So fairly quick, you know, based on ideas from photos. Photos then put aside, I made up a sketch, gave myself some idea as to the type of place that I was conjuring up, the type of mood, the type of atmosphere, and you know how important that is as an exercise to get creative. I think it's probably quite essential, in fact, to if you want to paint loose, is to think in the creative. I think you've got to develop that creative side. I hope you've enjoyed this demonstration. Please remember to subscribe if you haven't already, and do hit the bell icon, because then you will get immediate notification as and when I upload my new videos. If you want to participate in the live classes that I run monthly, then pop over to my website. There's a link below, and for the rest of the details they will be in the description below for materials and stuff like that. So hope you've enjoyed it, and hope to have your company again in the next one.